Ms. Dean, you're up first, and you may start whenever you are ready. I understand that you have reserved 2 minutes. I then understand that the lineup is 9 minutes for Mr. Cianci, 3 minutes for Mr. Oxenham, and 3 minutes for Mr. Twomey. Let me just start by saying the court is very pleased to see you, and welcome to the court today.
Thank you, Your Honor. And just a housekeeping method. I typically have trouble breathing. It has nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with that. And so I may be tugging on my mask a little because literally it fogs my glasses, and sometimes I literally have to take it off. So I apologize, but it's just because breathing is good.
I understand, and I have that fogging problem myself. But because of the juxtaposition between you and our court staff, I'm going to insist that you keep the mask on.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Yep.
Please proceed.
May it please the court, my name is Penny Dean, and I represent Representative Hoell.
About the gallery, but just briefly, nothing in the House's plans, there's nothing in front of you that suggests in any way that the gallery isn't going to be open. The House could very easily, as some states have done, have the officers be present and keep the gallery open and whatever representatives want to be there. That's not the question before you as to the mechanisms of how the House is going to deal with it. The question before you is, what does the word present mean in Article 20? The pleadings in this case, the other parties have sort of parsed that word to death. I mean, there's probably 100 pages of definitions in front of you, and I don't have anything to add to that. But I would suggest that that's not really where your focus should be in a case like this. In petition of Velo, which was a redistricting case that I represented the petitioners in 2004, the following sentence was stated, and I think it should guide you. While we acknowledge that a literal reading of Part 2, Articles 9, 11, and 26 support the petitioner's argument, it ignores the purpose and intent of, and then it goes on to discuss the redistricting provisions. When you're trying to understand something, it is not enough to go to a dictionary and look at the dictionary meaning either in the 17th century or the 20th century. What you have to do is take that information, but then put it in the context of what the purpose and intent of the provisions in play that you're looking at were in the Constitution as a whole. If you were to come at the end of this and keep the legislature from meeting itself, I would suggest you'd be turning the Constitution on its head and just defeating the purpose and intent of the Constitution. The goal of the Constitution, if you look at the provisions, and I cited them, I won't go through them all again, but there's numerous provisions that provide for the continuity of the legislative function in government in the face of various threats. That runs right through the Constitution. Along with that is a threat of a weak executive power subject to control by the legislation. If you say the legislature can't meet in a reasonable manner, what you're doing is creating an executive without any restraints on it whatsoever.
But the constitutional provision 5A regarding continuity of government, it talks about emergency resulting from disasters caused by enemy attack.
That's
and
one of,
we don't have an enemy attack
right,
here.
we don't. We have another provision in which they talk about moving the place of the legislature, I think it's 43, where it talks actually about the governor when the House and Senate can't agree on where to meet in situations of threats to the health of the legislature. So they were concerned about threats to the health, and they said you can move the legislature. My point is that throughout the Constitution, there are no provisions about moving the executive. The only provision about continuity of the executive says if the executive can't serve, somebody from the legislature takes over running the executive branch. What the people that, in Warburton versus Thomas says, having recently shed the shackles of colonial rule, the voters, and by that they mean the framers, feared the reemergence of a strong executive, and that's why they set up this system. That's why there are 4 or 5
Mr.
provisions.
Twomey, your red light is on. Would you wrap up?
Well, I guess what I ask you to do is think about what present means, and it means to be able to hear, to be able to speak, and to be able to mostly to vote. Anything, the House has a million different ways they could now enable legislatures to do all 3 of those things, and that's the purpose and intent of that clause. And that's the only clause that's before you. The gallery clause is not before you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dean, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Justice. I would like to make 3 points. Number one, it would be meaningless for the constitutional provision to say the gallery would be open if there's not representatives conducting business below. Number two, the dictionary definition of not absent, we do not know two things. First of all, what dictionary the framers consulted, or at least I don't, there's no information before the court. And secondly, I think all of you would agree that there's, even in the 1800s, enough dictionaries out there we could open them up and probably find a close enough clone to the definition we wanted. So I go back to the framers' original intent. And I think most importantly, and now, we can call this pandemic unprecedented. I would respectfully say that that word does not apply here, the unprecedented word. And here is why. If you look at data going back just 30 years, 40, 50, 60 years, we have flu to a greater or lesser degree every year. Usually, depending on the year, more people die from the flu than have died from COVID, depending on the year. This is not something that they didn't know about. They've known about this for years and years and years. We had the 1918 that I referenced, okay? The bottom line is this is not a surprise. This is something, this particular variant is a surprise, but not the fact that we are faced with some sort of virus or some sort of decimating disease, if you will, that affects the public.
But in fact, that's the argument. Those facts are being advanced by your opponents in arguing that at the time this was enacted and adopted in 1784, in fact, people had in mind the fact that there'd just been a smallpox epidemic, and that therefore people possibly participating without being physically present was well within the minds of the original adopters of the Constitution.
I think their arguments, when read correctly, support my position, Justice. And here is why. The framers fought over words, over language. And the bottom line is they chose the word they chose. They could have chose different language. They did not. They were very, very clear. And throughout they talk about, and again, you have to look at the entirety of the Constitution, as I mentioned, and they clearly used the word present and gathering and greeting groups. They anticipated everyone meeting together.
Well, what about the line of cases that culminates in Hughes, where we say basically, as Justice Donovan said, the House has the ability to make its own rules, and as long as it's a reasonable set of rules, then we're not going to second guess that.
They do have the right to make their own rules, and I conceded that before, but they do not have a right to trample the Constitution. And the fact that, for example, 25 states have met this way, 25 states don't have state v. Ball. New Hampshire's been very, very definite over the years that we look to our own Constitution when it's more protective. That might be a criminal case, but it is still the same principle. So they get to make their own rules, but they don't get to trample the Constitution. They don't get to pick each part of the Constitution that they want to comport with and ignore the rest. And the fact that our founding fathers chose to, in numerous parts of the Constitution, to use the language they used about meeting and groups and assembly, I think should tell us how they felt and what they intended.
Your red light is on?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Dean.